Okay, this might be a little controversial, but hear me out. I'm going to talk about the preacher circle and Christian consumerism. So the first thing I want to talk about is the differences or the definitions of preachers. The first one I would call the good preacher. A good preacher is someone who's eloquent, who's articulate, who knows how to speak, he can communicate well, but he doesn't necessarily have to be faithful or accurate. Okay, so many times preachers are good. They are good comedians. They can make people laugh. They can grab people's attention. They're very charismatic in the way they talk, but they need help with their doctrine because they're not very accurate. They're not very faithful to the Bible. And then we've got the faithful preacher. Faithful preachers are usually very accurate. They're very faithful. They know the Bible inside and out, but their communication skills need help. So most of the time, these people, if you spend or if you give them about 5 hours and you ask them questions, you will see they are very, very accurate theologians. But the skill in communicating all that doctrine in a span of 40 to 50 minutes is not there yet. And so they stutter, they stumble a lot, they go around with their words, they keep going back and forth, or they cycle with their topics and their thoughts, and they don't know how to quote unquote lift off, and they don't know how to land the plane or land the sermon. Okay, so you've got the good preacher, and then you've got the faithful preacher, and then you can combine those to have the good and faithful. So from good and faithful servant, you've got the good and faithful preacher. This is the person who is articulate, eloquent, has the skill, knows how to communicate very complex truths in 40 to maybe 50 minutes to maybe an hour and a half. At the same time, they're very faithful, they're very accurate, and they know exactly what doctrines the Bible teaches and what doctrines the Bible rejects. And I believe, I'm actually convinced that the Bible, the goal of the Bible is to have good and faithful preachers. There's a balance. But if I were to choose, I would rather have faithful, accurate, but not very eloquent preachers instead of the master communicators that don't really have the right doctrine, for obvious reasons, okay? Now, saying all of that, I want to assert this. I believe every local church should have a preacher's circle. Why? I know the Bible does not forbid local churches from having just one preacher, but I don't see the Bible encouraging that model or that system. What happens if your preacher suddenly gets into an accident, gets an aneurysm, gets a heart attack, or dies of unnatural causes? What happens to the church? You suddenly lose a preacher, and because you just had one preacher to begin with, the whole church panics. And that's not a very good scenario to have. What I see the Bible encourage is that when Jesus sent people out, he sent them out in twos. Paul told Timothy to appoint leaders, plural, to appoint leaders. And presumably these are preachers as well. So here's what I think. Let me add, the Bible also tells us that the role of the elders, the apostles, the prophets, the teachers, the preachers, etc., their role is to equip the saints for works of ministry. So if you're a leader, if you're a church pastor or elder, God is calling you not just to minister, but to equip the saints to minister. Your goal is not just to preach, but to equip people to preach. Your goal is not just to know how to shepherd the flock, but to equip other people to shepherd the flock, right? So our call is to equip people to do the work with us instead of doing all the work ourselves. And that safeguards the church from, those kinds of situations, like if the single solo preacher dies, if the single solo teacher suddenly is hospitalized, the church gets put on hold, and that's a bad thing. Another thing I want to talk about is this. I tend to think long term. My default is always long term. I think about 5 to 10 years ahead all the time, for some weird reason, right? And when you think about it, I'm not thinking of the one time that one guest attends church and listens to a not very skilled but very faithful teacher. Why do I say that? Because the only way to turn faithful preachers into good and faithful preachers is experience. You gotta share the pulpit. I'm fully convinced that the best thing for every church is to always share the pulpit with new, fresh-blooded preachers and teachers who might not be very good, but they're very faithful. They might not be eloquent, but they're very doctrinally sound. Because the more experience they have behind the pulpit, the more you give them what we call pulpit experience, the more their skill grows. And I think long-term, it's more beneficial, not less. It's more beneficial. Because if there's one person who comes to church and just listens to a preacher and they're not impressed by the skill, they'll say, oh, the person's accurate but not very skillful at preaching. You know, if that's their attitude, they just look at the skill and not the accuracy, then that's not the kind of church members I would want in the church anyway, right? Like as a leader, as a church leader, I'd rather have people who are interested in the accuracy of the preaching because they want churches to be faithful to the word than people who just attend church because they like to admire the skill, the communication skills of whoever's speaking in front. And when you change the culture from a Christian consumerism culture to a growth culture, okay, not just growth in numbers, but health-wise, okay, spiritual health. When your church always shares the pulpit to fresh-blooded newbie preachers, and your church members actually witness the growth of the preacher from someone who was very accurate but not very skilled, and you keep sharing the pulpit with them, share the pulpit with them, share the pulpit with them over and over again over the course of months or even years. What happens? What happens is your church members will not only see the improvement and see the growth, they're going to get so encouraged that God is really growing the men in the church. Not just that, you're going to create a culture where it's okay to not be perfect. It's okay if you're not at a certain level of skill yet, because the church rejoices not at the skill but at the growth. You're creating a culture in the church where people rejoice at the sanctifying work of God more than the sanctification level of each person. Okay, so that's what we're focusing on. So you're encouraging not just the people who are growing themselves, the preachers. You're also encouraging everyone else who see the consistent growth. You're lessening the burden from the preachers because there's no longer pressure on just one or two preachers, but then you've got a preachers circle where they all share the burden. And the best part for me is this. Here's the best part. There is an exponential benefit. It's all of that combined is when you, and the result is you get a church where everybody is encouraged, either witnessing the growth of others or witnessing the growth in themselves as young preachers, and the older preachers will witness that growth as well. The burden is removed from them in so many different areas. And here's a clincher. You don't need to upload everything on social media. That's the best part. Why? Because the truth of the matter is a lot of people can be what we call Christian consumers. They just want to consume content, but they don't really want to commit. And don't have, as a church, I'm saying this as a church leader as well, don't feel pressured to actually upload everything. Some of the most intimate moments in life are best kept within family. You know, the first step of a baby, the first time your daughter or your son calls you daddy or mommy or dad or mom, those aren't things you upload on social media. They just happen and it's just stuck in your memory, and it's a beautiful memory. So don't feel pressured to try to perform for the world. Instead, just think of how your church can grow as a local church for the glory of God without the pressure of the outside world. And I think that's the best thing for every church. God bless you guys.